20. Two-part poison. The man leaned on a silver-tipped cane. Behind him was the matte black Rolls-Royce of legend. Even the windows of the car were tinted dark. A small elderly man stood beside him, holding an umbrella, so that Lionel Salts would stay dry. Half the man's coat was already dark with rain. Just looking at him filled her with a feeling of horror so strong that it locked up her muscles. She knew she had to get to her car, but her body urged her to run deeper into the woods and hide. "A job?" she called up to him, her voice surprisingly steady. "I hired a man, Hermes Fortune, who is in the same line of work as you. Unfortunately, he's gone missing. It seems I need a new thief. And I hear you're quite good." Charlie made it up the hill and gave him a wide berth as she headed for her car. The sparkly dress she'd worn to the MGM burned bright in the late morning light. In the reflection of the car window, her smeared makeup, marred by tear tracks, made her feel entirely too vulnerable. Maybe the rain would wash her face for her, although she suspected it would only make things worse. "I'm out of the game," she said. "There's a guy named Adam that does a bunch of my old gigs. Balthazar can put the two of you in touch." The corner of his mouth turned up. "Adam Larkin. I have him working on something else for me." Balthazar had told her that Adam failed to find the Liber Noctum. She didn't think of Salt as someone who went back to people who disappointed him. Had Salt been the person on the other end of the phone call she'd overheard? "That's too bad," Charlie said. "I still can't help you." "I spoke to an old acquaintance of mine, Odette Fevre. It seems you might have been the last person to see Hermes alive. Such a coincidence, don't you think? She called you Charlie Hall. Is that your real name? I've only ever heard you called the Charlatan." It just figured that Odette knew him. She had enough wealthy clients to have had to cross paths with local billionaire Lionel Salts. And Odette had implied to Charlie that she'd talked to someone about Hermes. Charlie ought to have immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. At least Salt hadn't recognized her. Of course, she'd been 15, just a kid. And it wasn't like there'd been anything special about that night for him. He probably killed lots of people before and since. But if he thought blackmailing Charlie by holding the disappearance of Hermes over her head would work, he was far off the mark. After Rand, Charlie had learned that blackmail only gets worse with time. Also, she didn't think Odette gave a shit if Charlie was a stone-cold killer, so long as she showed up for her shifts on time and kept the till balanced. After the silence stretched long enough that he realized she wasn't going to answer, he spoke again. "Speaking of coincidences, what are the chances that a well-known pilferer of magical books would find herself involved with a man who ran away with one of mine?" "I do appreciate you calling me well-known," Charlie said. "My grandson certainly knew you, didn't he?" Salt's voice stayed level, but he clearly didn't like her attitude. Probably he thought someone who'd peed in the woods and who looked as though they'd had the kind of night people promise not to talk about outside of Vegas would have the grace to act ashamed. "The late Edmund Carver," she said. "My condolences." His eyes narrowed. "I believe you call him by his middle name." Odette described him in unmistakable detail. So let's drop the charade. Vince? Charlie said, all innocence. He dumped me yesterday afternoon. Looks like you just missed him. I think you better get in the car, Salt ground out, no longer trying to hide his anger. We have a lot to discuss, and I don't think either of us want to do it out here in the rain. So many young men of her acquaintance would be envious that she'd gotten an invitation to ride in the rolls. But the idea chilled her blood. I'm already wet, so no thanks. I'd only drip on your nice leather seat. Lionel Salt reached into the inside pocket of his wool coat and took out a matte black Glock. It matched the car perfectly. The elderly man holding the umbrella didn't so much as flinch. I'm afraid I am going to have to insist, Salt said, pointing the barrel of the gun casually, waving it toward her, not aiming. Not yet. It was broad daylight, and they were standing in the middle of a parking lot. Anyone could have walked out of Blue Ruin. There weren't many cars in the parking lot, but there weren't none. The road running past wasn't heavily trafficked, but vehicles passed every now and again. For Salt to be comfortable having his gun out reminded Charlie that he believed he could get away with anything. It had been more than a decade since vomiting up beet juice and running had saved her life. The night had haunted her since, but drugs and time had blurred her memories into a kaleidoscopic nightmare instead of a recollection. But the moment she'd seen Salt, that horror had surged back. She'd felt like a child again, running through the woods, monsters at her heels. She had no urge to go back to his big house and finish bleeding out on his library carpet. Under the circumstances, I really don't think I should go with you, she said, not moving. But you will, he told her, circling around the Corolla toward her. You're a smart girl. You'll make the smart choice. Charlie raised both her eyebrows. Clearly, you don't know anything about me. As Lionel Salt glowered at her, she couldn't help seeing the familial resemblance between him and Vince. They were both tall and had the same hard jaw and angry eyebrows. But where Vince had no shadow, Salt's flickered behind him like a furious flame. She noted its height, its profile when Salt turned, and wondered whose shadow he'd stolen to finally be a glomist himself. My daughter is waiting for us in the car, Salt said, pointing the gun at Charlie with real intent now. I'd prefer not to upset her. I'll even pay you for your time. But this is your last opportunity to make the correct choice. So you're gonna pay me if I go and shoot me if I stay? Charlie asked. His smile grew, appreciating her observation. The world works by two principles, the carrot and the stick. If you know Odette, then you know sometimes the carrot is the stick. But despite the remark, and despite her certainty that going with him was stupid, she was aware of how few choices she had. Getting shot the last time had sucked, and this time was likely to kill her. Come along, he said. We'll have a little lunch, in public, very civilized. We can discuss what you're going to do for me, and how much time you'll have to accomplish the task. Without quite agreeing, she moved in the direction of Salt's car. There might be no getting out of going for this ride, but she reminded herself that she'd gotten away from him once, and would again. Oh, and this time, She really would make him pay. For the past, for the gun he had on her, but most of all for sending in Hermes and wrecking a perfectly good relationship built on perfectly good lies. The elderly man with the umbrella, small and wiry, built like a jockey, opened the door to the back seat. I told you my grandfather was strict, right? He taught me lots of stuff. He believed in the improving power of work, no matter how old you were. He didn't believe in excuses. And he had a limo that broke down sometimes. There was no way Salt had taught Vince to fix cars himself, but he could have insisted that someone else did. You liked Edmund, didn't you? She asked the driver. He didn't look particularly pleased to be spoken with. Everyone liked Edmund, Miss Hall, he answered, low-voiced. She slid into the car. Even with sunglasses on, the woman occupying the seat on the other side of a large center console was unmistakably the one from the photos of galas in New York. Salt's daughter, and Edmund Vincent Carver's aunt. Though so alike in age, she looked more like a sister. She wore tight black pants tucked into suede boots, a patterned blue georgette blouse, and a shearling jacket. Her blonde hair was much lighter than Edmund's, duckling gold. They must have cut a swath through Manhattan's elite hearts and beds. I'm Adeline, she said as Charlie slid in. Sorry about Father. He can be a terrible bully. Carrot and stick. Salt said something to the driver in a low voice, then got in the front passenger seat. The smell of leather and expensive air freshener made Charlie's head spin. Let's get some coffee, Salt said, turning to look back at her. You look as though you could use some. And fresh clothes, Adeline said, wrinkling her nose, then smiled at Charlie. No offense. I've woken up plenty of mornings in last night's party rags. Party rags? It wasn't that she couldn't picture Vince spending time with her, because he had a deep well of patience. What she couldn't picture was Vince being like her. The car pulled out onto the road, swinging away from the bar, Charlie's Corolla, and any hope of an easy escape. A few minutes later, the car stopped in front of the Roost, a coffee shop at the edge of Northampton's downtown. An employee came out with a tray of coffees and a bag that the driver accepted through the front window. Charlie wondered if there was a sign she could give that she was being kidnapped, like those clever women who manage to signal that they're in trouble during pizza deliveries. If there was something, though, Charlie's hangover prevented her from thinking of it. The car pulled away from the curb in the direction of I-91. The wipers swept across the windshield like a metronome. She took a nervous sip of the coffee. Adeline had gotten some matcha concoction, which left a trace of green foam on her upper lip. I am a person who is used to getting what I want, Salt began, an understatement if ever she'd heard one. And what I want is a book returned to me. Liber Noctum, the Book of Night. Look for a book that Edmund is keeping under lock and key with a metal cover, and that will be it. There are no words on the cover. It may appear like a journal. Charlie nodded, unwilling to agree to get it for him, and took another sip of coffee. She waited. Sometimes silence kept people talking. Sometimes if they talked enough, they wouldn't notice when you didn't. In this case, it worked. Salt went on. My grandson can be charming, but selfish. It's not his fault that he uses people. He grew up with an addict for a mother. She put him into situations and left him among people with whom no child should associate. They lived on the street, even slept in cars. From a young age, he had to learn to survive and to shapeshift into whatever pleased the people he was around. By the time I got hold of him, he was 13 and practically ruined. Charlie cut a glance in Adeline's direction. The woman was frowning at her hands, as though she didn't like what her father was saying but was unwilling to openly disagree. Although Charlie was loath to believe Salt about anything, a history like that would explain how Vince was able to behave like a normal person, even after more than a decade of being steeped in extreme wealth. A child who'd lived in poverty for 13 years, one who'd been the responsible person in a household, might well know how to clean gutters, might have learned how to make tacos and do laundry and all the stuff that would have come less easily to a rich layabout. And as for using people, well, he'd used Charlie, hadn't he? Salt went on. When most people look up at the stars, they are frightened by the vastness of the universe and their own lack of significance. She heard the echo of Vince's voice. Do you think that stars have shadows? But I have always been comforted, he said. And do you know why? Charlie shook her head, since that seemed like what she was supposed to do. Because they signified possibility. And all that vastness, it was impossible that the universe didn't have secrets left to be ferreted out. And when I took in my grandson, I saw that I was right. Because for all that was broken in him, he had one incredible talent. Magic, Charlie guessed. Salt nodded. When I saw him command it, which he did without a split tongue, having no formal education with any glomist, I felt as though I had found what I'd been looking for my whole life. A true secret of the universe and a path to greater mysteries. But for Edmund, it was merely a crude little trick. He played with the thing like it was some imaginary friend and sent it off to steal candy and cigarettes. The car pulled into a long drive marked with a carved and painted sign proclaiming they were entering the grounds of the Grand Berkshire Private Club. It seemed as though Salt intended to keep his word about taking her to lunch, in public. I will send you 2 girls to the spa. There are showers with which to refresh yourself, Miss Hall. The staff can bring you clothing. We'll meet for lunch in a half hour, and then we can finish our business. Now, see, isn't that civilized? It was, except for the gun in his pocket. The driver came around again and opened the door. Adeline allowed him to take her hand as though she were departing a carriage. Charlie followed, scooting out inelegantly, trying not to flash her panties. The rain had turned into a light drizzle. She looked around, taking in the rolling green grounds, most of them a golf course. The grass looked impossibly bright for this late in the fall. There was a large building in the distance that seemed to be the common space of the country club. The spa building was smaller, its wooden shingles painted the charmingly cottage-core color of a fern. A sign set to one side of the door proclaimed that this was the Relaxation and Wellness Center. Inside, the air was warm, humid, and scented heavily with eucalyptus. A woman behind a desk took 2 towels from the shelves behind her and placed them on the counter. She smiled at them, as though it was utterly normal to have a hung-over client in a spangly dress with makeup all over her face. The steadiness of her gaze didn't so much as flicker. We'd like a private sauna room, Adeline said. And we need some clothing in a size 12? 14, Charlie corrected. The woman continued to smile. There are towels and robes waiting for you. Would you like some cucumber water? Absolutely. Charlie felt dehydrated enough to drink a bathtub of cucumber water. Do you have aspirin? Of course. Anything else? Charlie wondered if there was anything they could ask for that would dent her smile. A giraffe? A hot air balloon? The loan of a crossbow so she could shoot Salt in the back? Still making that mental list, Charlie followed Adeline into the sauna room. White lockers lined the left wall, robes hanging on attached hooks. The door to the sauna itself was shut, with a lot of dials on the door meant to, she supposed, optimize the heat and moisture levels, as though she and Adeline were lizards in an extremely fancy tank. And there was a shower room. Charlie grabbed a robe. Back in a minute, she called to Adeline. Under the steady heat and excellent water pressure, Charlie scrubbed her face with body wash, ignoring the way it stung her eyes. She shampooed her hair twice, then shrugged on the robe. Adeline stood waiting for her, hair twisted up in a tortoise-shell clip. A sauna really is the best thing for a hangover. You sweat out the liquor. Charlie spotted a pitcher of cucumber water and a bottle of aspirin sitting on a silver tray. She took a generous helping of both before following Adeline into the steam. The air inside the little room was scented even more strongly of eucalyptus than the front desk, and so thick she seemed to be drinking it as much as breathing it in. Charlie hadn't been in a sauna before, so she wasn't sure if that was normal. The combination of heat and moisture created a claustrophobic but not entirely unpleasurable sensation. She sat on a bamboo bench and stretched out her bare toes. You've got a bruise, Adeline said, pointing to where Charlie's calf had come up black and blue after being knocked around by Hermes' shadow only 3 days before. Charlie decided the best thing she could do was ignore that and redirect the conversation. You and Edmund are almost the same age, right? Adeline hesitated, as though the question bothered her. We were close from the time he first came to live with us. My half-sister was so much older than I was that I never knew her well. So it was easier to think of Remy as a brother, more than anything else. Her half-sister. Right. Edmund's mother. What about your mom? Did she mind having another kid in the house? She was a model from the Netherlands. Used to children behaving differently than American kids. She thought there was something wrong with him. Adeline smiled as though recalling a fond memory. Edmund cursed. A lot. What about now? Adeline sighed. She lives in New York since the divorce. My mother found father's obsession with gloaming distasteful. The painkillers must have kicked in because Charlie's head hurt less. It was a little easier to think, and it bothered her even more that this whole situation didn't add up. Why did Edmund decide to take off? He didn't want to do what father said anymore. Something in Adeline's face made Charlie wonder if Adeline wasn't feeling a little rebellious herself. Father asked a lot from Edmund. She could imagine. His grandson was the one with the magic, after all. Even once Salt got himself a quickened shadow, he still wouldn't have the years of experience his grandson had. That was impossible to buy, and Charlie could only imagine how much that would grind Salt's gears. A man who was used to buying anything, unable to buy the power a kid had. What was he like with you? Adeline asked. The question was inflected oddly, as if one of the words meant something else. Perhaps Adeline thought of Edmund as a shapeshifter, the way his grandfather had described him, changing to suit the person he was with. It was hard to argue with that. After all, if he was different with everyone, then how could she know? But Charlie did have one way to describe him. You ever been to the Quabbin? The reservoir? Adeline looked slightly horrified. You know there's a whole town down there, Charlie said. Buried under the waves. That's what Vince was like. A drowned town. Still along the surface. Everything's hidden underneath. You can't know, Adeline started, then cut herself off. Looking down at the slim gold watch with a diamond case on her wrist, still miraculously running despite the heat and the moisture of the room, she cleared her throat. It's almost time to meet Father for lunch. We ought to go. She stood. Charlie followed her lead, rising and stretching until she got a satisfyingly audible crack from her shoulder blades. In the changing room, Adeline regarded her speculatively. I know you're not going to think this is nice of me to say, but I'm glad you're not with Edmund anymore. She was right. It wasn't nice, but it was interesting. The spa had left an outfit for Charlie hanging from one of the lockers. It had the look of coming from a golf shop, one that she imagined was probably in the main building. Pants in a stretchy navy material, a white-collared shirt, and a navy chevron zip-up jacket. They'd brought her white tennis shoes and socks, but her flats were fine, with just a little dried mud at the edges. She got dressed and braided her hair, but without a clip, it immediately began to unravel. Charlie's gaze fell on her shadow. In all this talk, no one had quite explained how Vince lost his, or when. Charlie, Adeline called. She blinked, coming out of her thoughts. A golf cart idled in front of the spa, the driver waiting to take them to the main building. Charlie didn't have to go to lunch. She could head back inside, insist that someone call her a cab, put on her own clothes back at home. But if Salt wanted to find her again, he had the resources to do it. He could tail her to and from work in his roles. For all she knew, he might be able to send a cop to her house to pick her up for him. Maybe that nice detective Juarez. Enough money bought anything. The grass was wet against her ankles as she walked to the golf cart. Then she hung on as they crossed the parking lot past Bentleys and Lexuses. Charlie wondered how many of Odette's clients were members here. Inside the main building, Charlie followed Adeline across a gleaming stone floor to the restaurant. The host didn't ask their names, just led them to a private room where the walls were covered in yellow silk and paintings of horses, coats gleaming like polished mahogany, hung atop the cloth. Lionel Salts was already waiting for them at the table, nursing a low-ball glass of whiskey with an ice globe sitting in it. She took in his wrinkles, his faded age spots and too pale skin, as though he'd try to bleach them away. The smoothness of his forehead from injections. He wore a black turtleneck and dark gray pants. On his finger, a gold ring marked with an unfamiliar arcane symbol gleamed. Charlie noted that neither he nor Adeline wore any onyx. This is a lot of trouble to go to for a conversation, Charlie said as the host hastened to pull out her seat for her. You look refreshed. Salt exchanged a look with Adeline, who nodded. Maybe there had been some kind of 2-part poison in her cucumber water. If she started to feel woozy, she was going to stab Salt in the chest with whatever knife there was, even if it was a butter knife. He leaned over to a waiter. We will have the smoked pheasant confit salad, the Kansan cherry blossom tea cured salmon, and the grilled lamb loin. He looked at Charlie. I assume you're not a vegetarian. She shook her head. After a night of drinking, what she really wanted was a greasy egg and bacon sandwich. But he was the guy with the Glock. And a bottle of Chateau d'Eclon 2018 Garris Rosé, he concluded. The waiter nodded. I'll just take an iced tea, Charlie said. After the waiter departed, Salt put his hands on the table. His nails were clean and buffed. If she were conning Salt, she'd note the veneer of perfection, the need for control. It manifested in the way Adeline was quiet unless invited to speak. The way he'd immediately taken the gun from his pocket when Charlie refused to go with him. He expected automatic obedience and acknowledgement of his superiority from people like Charlie. And like Vince. The best way to con Salt would be to let him dominate. Let him win. He'd believe that and he'd never look deeper. So, Salt said, putting his elbows on the table and peering across at her. We have something in common. My darling grandson wronged us both. He took something from me and broke your heart. Isn't that right? Adeline frowned at her plate. Either she was more on Vince's side than she wanted her father to know, or Charlie being with Vince had really bothered her. Maybe she hated all of his girlfriends. I suppose so, Charlie said. Then let us be allies. You won't just be helping me by getting back my book. You'll be stopping Edmund from committing a great wrong. You see, as I told you before, my grandson, in his idiosyncratic way, treated his shadow like some cross between a pet and a friend. To command a shade, one must be a good custodian. Provide blood and energy from our own bodies. We gift unto them life, and in return they give us utter obedience. They are us, after all, formed from us, as we were once made of sculpted clay and the Lord's breath. Charlie was surprised by the religiosity of his description. She had spent a few Sundays at Laura's church trying to con Laura's parents into believing that she wasn't a terrible influence. The only parts she remembered in detail were the songs, the free donuts in the basement, and a lot of language like this. Salt went on. But the sacrament is an unholy one. We give our shadows the parts of us that we want to shove down into the dark. Our anger, our jealousy, our gluttony, our most shameful desires. Imagine a hate-filled creature made of everything monstrous about a person, a thing that feeds on energy and blood. Now imagine coddling that, Miss Hall. Charlie tried to picture Vince with a shadow like that, and found it easy to see why he'd been willing to overlook so many of Charlie's faults. He named it Red, Salt said. Red and Remy, isn't that sweet? Maybe that's what it calls itself now. What do you mean? Charlie asked. Once Edmund's shadow was cut free, it became a blight. A blight of a living person? Charlie objected. Formed in childhood, with a child's foolish allowance for gluttony. He overfed the thing, gave it too much blood, and not just his own. By the time Edwin was an adult, his shadow was very powerful. Powerful enough to have desires of its own. It was for that reason Edmund stole the Liber Noctum from me. To bring his blight to full life, a shadow no more. That can't be true, Charlie said, not even sure to what part she objected. The Liber Noctum details the method by which a blight can acquire and maintain enough substance to pass for human. He looked across the table at her, as though willing her to understand. The author presented this as a secret to immortality. But what no glomist attempting to recreate the ritual realized was that it wouldn't be their consciousness that survived. And so, they were deceived unto their own deaths, and their shadows, swollen with stolen energy, walk among us. To all appearances human. Perhaps to this day. That sounded like internet creepypasta. Impossible. Ridiculous. But Charlie couldn't help remembering how Vince had told her what he'd done was worse than her accusations. Something so bad he refused to explain it. "You don't want to believe me," Salt said. "But you do." The waiter came in, interrupting them to bring in the wine. He filled all 3 glasses with a deep pink rosé, then wrapped a towel around the neck of the bottle and rested it in a silver ice bucket. Finally, he set Charlie's tea in front of her, a thick lemon wedge decorating the side and a sprig of mint in with the cubes. Lionel waved him away when he began to ask if they needed anything. "What did you do to Vincent, Mr. Salt?" Charlie asked. Adeline gave her a sharp, surprised look. "What did I do?" he asked, as though trying out being offended. "Something caused him to leave when he did. Do you really expect me to believe it was because you had a crisis of conscience over him experimenting with his shadow?" Adeline took her wine glass and drained it in one long swallow. "This is awful. Just tell her." "I am, my dear," he said, with slightly too firm an emphasis for the words to be true. He turned to Charlie. "Edmund was unreasonable about Red. You know enough of blights to know how horrifying they are. They're made from the worst parts of us. They can be enormously powerful. And they are invariably insane. That's why some blights are disposed of and others are caught and tethered to new wearers. Controlling them is the only thing that keeps humanity safe." Charlie knew a few glomists wore blights instead of their own quickened shadows, although it had never seemed like the wisest idea. Gloaming was too young an art for its practitioners not to attempt dangerous paths to power, though. Posey might be willing to do it. Who was she kidding? Posey would jump at the chance. But it didn't seem like Vince not to be aware of the danger in letting a blight roam free. And it didn't seem like Salt to worry about the safety of humanity. Charlie was glad when the waiter came back with the food, forcing the conversation to a stop. Salt directed him to set the lamb loin in front of her. Charlie took an absent bite and chewed mechanically, barely tasting what she was eating. "It's true I had a hand in what happened next," Salt said, once the waiter had refilled their wine glasses and departed. "I tried to save Edmund from Red, but my grandson released his shadow before I could destroy it. Now it's loose in the world. You see why I must have my book before he manages to complete the method outlined in it. What Edmund intends cannot happen. A blight who could pass for human, with an endless hunger. Would you want that walking our streets, doing to others what it did to Paul Echo and Night Sing?" "Vince wouldn't do that," Charlie said. "He won't," Salt said, "because you're going to bring the Book of Night to a gathering this Saturday, and we are going to keep it safe. Do we understand each other?" Charlie was still stuck on his accusation. Why would Vince's shadow, Red, have killed those people? One of them got a piece of the book, which it wouldn't like, Salt said, with a twist of his mouth and a glare. The other knew too much about the contents of the Liber Noctem. But red needs to kill. The more blood and shadow energy it consumes, the more powerful it becomes, and the more ready for the ritual. By the time Charlie looked down at her plate, the only thing that remained were smears of red from the rare meat. She wiped the edges of her mouth with her napkin. She didn't recall eating any of it. This book has been missing for a year or more. What makes you think I can get it by Saturday? Charlie asked. You know, Edmund. You can do what no one else can. Determine where he could have put a book he didn't want anyone to find. I am having a little soiree for the Glomus community in celebration of my elevation to the Cabal. Having the book would be a worthy proof of how successful I will be in my new position. Charlie stared at him in horror. Sure, the Cabal was a bootleg governing body, but it served to identify threats to the community, like loose blights or laws meant to regulate gloaming, and employ a hierophant. It also kept the local gloamists in check. Someone as monstrous as Salt on there, to be one of the 5 people making decisions, was going to be bad for everyone. No. One of 4 people, Charlie realized, because Night Singh was dead. I appreciate the offer of work, but the job's not for me, Charlie said. I have no idea where Vince is or what he did with your book. For all I know, he got rid of it. And besides, I don't like you. You kidnapped me at gunpoint. And you're kind of a dick. Telling him that wasn't revenge. But it wasn't nothing. Adeline sucked in her breath. Salt looked at Charlie across the table, and there was something in his face as though in anticipation of some great pleasure. That's all the warning she got, before his shadow flowed toward her and sank into her skin. Before she understood what was happening, her hand lifted the steak knife just as the waiter returned to the room. She could sense the shadow inside her, a separate consciousness. She could hear its thoughts and sense the enormity of its hatred. Her mouth opened and she could feel her tongue begin to form words, her voice rough with resistance. I will murder. Then she was free and shaking with horror, uncertain if she cast the shadow off with her will or if Salt let her go. He laughed at the waiter's startled face. She becomes heated when we discuss politics, but there's no harm in her. Isn't that true, my dear? Charlie bit her tongue and didn't answer, too afraid that it wouldn't be her own words coming out of her mouth. Salt leaned in close, dropping his voice to a whisper. You have a week to steal the Liber Noctem for me. Given your reputation, I am certain of your success. But if you fail, we'll see what else I can make you do, and to whom. You have a sister, isn't that right? Now, would you like coffee before you go? A cordial? Anger and fear and fury rose in Charlie like a wave, sweeping every other thought away. She hadn't thought it was possible to despise him more than she did, but now her hands were shaking with a desire for violence. She wanted to break a glass and use it to slice open his face. She wanted to watch him squirming on the carpet as poison stole his consciousness. Salt's smile grew as he studied her expression. She had the sinking suspicion that he enjoyed her hating him. It was another kind of power. He wiped the edges of his mouth with a cloth napkin. I need to hear you say that you understand, that you will be at my estate on Saturday, book in hand. Charlie pushed back her chair and got up, biting the inside of her cheek. You have my word? He nodded. Good day to you, charlatan. As she turned to go, though, Adeline grabbed her hand. I know you saw the news stories. Before you judge my father, remember what Red is capable of doing. Was Vince's shadow really out there, murdering people in anticipation of some transformation? Was that what had happened to Rose Alaband? How responsible had Vince been for all of this? And yet, Rand's body had also been found in a car, along with a dead girl that Charlie was fairly certain he'd never even met while alive, all staged by Salt. Maybe Vince hadn't faked his own death. What if he'd just taken the book and run? If Salt had set up the burned husk of the car with charred bodies inside, Vince would have been pronounced dead, making it impossible for him to get far or to go to the authorities. If anyone thought he was alive, he'd be wanted for murder. Of course, that didn't explain Red. Let go of me, Charlie told her. Adeline's fingers dug into Charlie's skin. You think you know Remy, but you're wrong. Charlie pulled her hand out of the woman's grip and walked from the room as fast as she could. She wasn't even sure where she was going, so long as it was away from the Salt family and their horrifying desires and demands. As she crossed the smooth tiles of the reception hall, she spotted a man leaning against the wall. Charlie's heart sped. He was younger than most people walking through the country club, dark-haired, with deep-set eyes and bruised skin underneath. Bullet holes. She'd thought of them that night when she first saw him in the alley. But up close, his eyes just seemed tired. Then her gaze fell to the area between the edges of his gloves and the cuffs of his shirt. It didn't show much, but she could see there was shadow where the skin of his wrist should have been. You're the Hierophant, she forced herself to say. He smiled, but it was all wrong. Too many facial muscles were engaged. His mouth was pulled in too many directions. Yes, he said, as though forcing the words out. I am hunting a blight. Charlie took an involuntary step back, alarmed more by the way he spoke than what he said. It reminded her suddenly and horribly of how she had sounded when Salt controlled her. Red? She asked him. A gleam appeared in his eye. You've seen him, haven't you? She shook her head. The Hierophant gave her one of those strange smiles. I was a thief once, like you. If she'd gotten caught in the wrong place at the wrong moment, she could have wound up like him. Hands cut off, sent out to kill blights. Had he been a Glomus before? Most thieves weren't, if for no other reason than it was hard for a shadow to cross the onyx protections most Glomists put in place. Your shadow, Charlie began, wanting to ask if it had quickened on its own or if they'd bound him to something. His eyes narrowed and he pushed off the wall, taking a step toward her. Once they get their claws into you, they never let go. She scuttled back. The Hierophant cocked his head to the side and began to speak, at first in a monotone, then in a rising shout. Tell Red I want the book. Tell Red we can share. Tell Red that I will rip him to pieces. As he continued to advance toward her, Charlie turned and ran. Her flats slapped against the polished floor. "21. The Past." Remy Carver stood on a cobbled street in Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood. trying to appear like a normal teenager instead of the conductor of a murder. He felt the pull of his shadow, as though there was a rope between them, thinning as Red floated up the stairs of the row house. Across the street, an elderly woman in a fur-collared coat walked a fat chihuahua. She glanced toward Remy, and he turned away, moving deeper into the shadows, his heart hammering. Maybe he should have come at 2 a.m, instead of just past 11 at night. His grandfather argued for this hour, saying that he would be less conspicuous when there were other people on the street. But there was no time when it didn't look a little suspicious for a 14-year-old boy to be hanging around with a couple of trash cans, waiting for his invisible friend to finish killing somebody. Remy didn't belong in a place like this, no matter who his grandfather was. The window boxes full of spring flowers and gleaming brass door knockers made him uncomfortable. He tried to concentrate on something other than what was happening upstairs, even though part of him could see out of Red's eyes. His shadow had made it to the man's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, no barrier at all. The man was asleep, wife beside him. She had one of those cannulas in her nose, the ones that supplied extra oxygen. Remy shook his head, pressed his eyes shut as though that would stop the images from coming. No. Think about the last time he saw his mother and how much better she was doing. But that memory wasn't so good either, because she'd wanted him to come live with her and he couldn't. Think about the fancy private school he was attending and how Adeline had introduced him to her friends. They'd thought he was cool. He knew how to score drugs and how to spot a guy heading into a liquor store who'd buy them a bottle of Grey Goose for an extra 20. They wanted him to come to their ski lodges this winter. They wanted him to come to their islands for spring break. And wasn't that a hell of a lot better than what he'd been doing last year? Wrapping duct tape around his sneakers so his feet wouldn't get wet? Trudging through the gray snow. It was worth it. This was worth it. That's what he concentrated on as Red flowed down the man's throat, as Remy's head echoed with awful sounds, as the wife woke up and started screaming. Think of having a home. Think of Mom going to the kind of rehabs that celebrities hung out at. Think of a future. Think of Adeline, who wanted to be his sister. Don't think about Red. Ever since his grandfather had discovered how useful Remy could be, he'd wanted him to use his shadow. And his grandfather started collecting books on glow-mists, spouting off about how Remy was doing it wrong, how Remy needed to understand that Red was just an extension of him, like a hand, something he had total control over. That acting like Red could make his own decisions was dangerous. But Remy didn't want to kill anyone. It was bad enough he had to be a participant in it. He couldn't imagine being wholly aware of what he was doing, pushing himself down the man's throat, watching his eyes bulge and his tongue loll, listening to the frantic howls of the wife close enough that his ears would feel like they were bleeding. When it was done, Remy wiped tears from the sides of his eyes. He hated knowing the man was dying, and he hated the dying man, too. If only he'd just gone along with Remy's grandfather's business stuff, then they'd all be less miserable. It didn't take long for Red to return, sliding across the cobblestones toward him. But his shadow stopped before returning to his dormant place. Instead, Red stood black against the brick wall, as upright as Remy was, in defiance of the streetlights and any natural law. "You're unhappy," Red said, although the words could only be heard in Remy's mind. Adeline had explained to him that Red was the part of Edmund that Edmund didn't know about, like a subconscious. But Red didn't feel like his subconscious, He felt like an attic, a place to shove things Remy didn't want to deal with. At the new fancy private school that his grandfather insisted he attend, they didn't like people getting into fights. So Remy didn't get into them anymore. Even though at his old school he had to get up in people's faces if he wanted to be respected. But that anger had to go somewhere. And when Remy felt sad at times like this, or when he was missing his mother, he put that sadness into Red, too. His pity for the people his grandfather wanted dead. Which wasn't fair, because Red shouldn't have to kill people and feel sorry for them. But Red wasn't real. He was Remy's subconscious. Or an attic. He used to be a friend. "So what? It's over?" Remy said, thrusting all the sadness away from him. He wondered if Red would complain, but it was his energy, right? Like the blood that fed him. "Next time, cut me free," Red said, "and when the thing is done, I will return." Remy hated it when his shadow said stuff that didn't seem to come from his thoughts at all, things that surprised him. He'd used to like it, back when it was moves in a game or sprinting ahead in a race. "We need to go," he muttered, and set off, stalking down the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets. The police would be coming soon, and an ambulance. Let his shadow follow. 22. The Scholar and the Shadow. Once they hit the highway, the elderly chauffeur cleared his throat. "There's something in the back seat for you, Miss Hall." On the floor mat, where it must have slid, she found a book with a red leatherette cover, stamped in gold. After stealing so many old, crumbling volumes, there was something odd about holding a modern book crafted to seem to come from another time. The title read, "Complete Works of Hans Christian Andersen." A $100 bill was tucked into a page, acting as a bookmark. The story was called simply, The Shadow. With little else to do on the ride home, she read. It featured a scholar from the cold north who traveled to a marvelous city in the south, but was unable to bear the heat of its days. He shrank beneath the hot sun, growing thin and exhausted. Even his shadow seemed to fade. Only in the evenings, as the cool breezes came, did he begin to feel like himself again. He would sit out on his balcony with a candle and watch his shadow stretch and lengthen in the night air. Charlie felt a little shiver go through her. She read on. Beneath the scholar and his shadow, the city appeared magnificent by moonlight. Rattling carriages passed musicians playing mandolins. Church bells rang. Donkeys carried carts of ripe fruit back from the markets. The scholar drank in scents of spices and smoke and lush flowers. He was particularly struck by those blooming on the balcony opposite his, from where the sound of singing came. Each night, the scholar would sit on his balcony and look across. Once, he thought he spotted a beautiful maiden among the flowers. When he looked again, she was gone. But in the candlelight, his shadow became long enough to stretch across the street to the girl's window. Make yourself useful, the scholar told his shadow, laughing. Go look inside and tell me what you see. But be sure to come back. And with that, the scholar went to bed. But his shadow did not. It scampered away to look, and despite his command, never returned. The scholar found this very vexing. Soon, however, he found a new little shadow beginning to grow from the very tips of his feet. By the time he returned from the hot country, he had a freshly grown shadow that was perfectly sufficient, and decided to be content with that. One night, many years later, there was a tapping on his door. On the other side was a very thin person, immaculately dressed. Looking at him made the scholar feel odd, but he ushered the stranger inside despite his misgivings. The stranger introduced himself as the man's shadow. Astonished, the scholar was nonetheless a little amused to see him again. The shadow told him many tales of his adventures and how, since he was able to slip in anywhere and see all those things that the powerful wanted to keep hidden, he had done very well for himself. He had become quite wealthy. The scholar marveled at this, for he had remained poor. The shadow invited the scholar to travel with him and offered to pay his way. This was a bit too much for the scholar's pride, but in the end, he relented. Away they traveled to a place where they could take the waters, with the shadow claiming he hoped it might heal his lack of a beard. As they went, the shadow made all the decisions and paid for all that they ate and drank. Soon the shadow began to treat the scholar more like a servant. Many people from all over came to the healing waters, and the shadow met a princess who had come to cure a condition she had, one which allowed her to see things too clearly. She took a look at the shadow and told him that he had come to the waters in the hopes that he might grow a new shadow. He laughed and said that she must be cured already, because his shadow was right there. And he indicated the scholar. The idea that his shadow was so much finer than anyone else's intrigued her. That night they danced together, and she told him of her country. He had been there, and had such a breadth of knowledge that she quickly fell in love with him. She wanted to marry him, but needed to assure herself of his wisdom, since a ruler ought to be wise as well as knowledgeable. She tested him by asking him a series of difficult philosophical questions. The shadow laughed, saying they were so simple that even his shadow could answer them. And when she put the same questions to the scholar, he answered them so handsomely that she agreed to marry the shadow immediately. That evening, the shadow made the scholar an offer. He could live with them and be wealthy all his days if he would tell everyone that he was the shadow and the shadow was the man. The scholar refused. He said he would go to the princess and tell her everything. But the shadow told him that if he tried, the shadow would tell the princess and her guards that the scholar was a liar. "Be reasonable," he said. "I am the one who's going to marry her, and they will listen to me instead of you." But the scholar insisted, and all was as the shadow predicted. The shadow told the princess's guards to seize the scholar, and they did. By the time the shadow and the princess were married, the scholar had been put to death and was no more. Charlie closed the book and saw that they had left I-91 and were weaving through back roads toward Blue Ruin. Putting her hand on the leatherette cover, she tried to put aside the story itself and focus on why Salt had given it to her. He wanted her to believe that Red wasn't just a threat to the world, but to Vince. She shouldn't care, but she had to admit that she did. Hatred of Salt burned in her gut. But no matter how much she despised him, no matter how sure she was that he was deceiving her, she was equally certain that he hadn't lied about everything. The chauffeur pulled into the lot and parked beside her Corolla. She got out, taking the book and the $100 bookmark with her. Salt had promised to pay, after all. The matte black Rolls-Royce was back on the road, speeding away into the late afternoon, as Charlie opened the door to her car. She held her breath until the engine started its usual miserable sputtering. Her purse was where she'd left it, in the back seat. Her phone was there too, with a missed call from Posey and another from work. She ignored those and called UMass's bursar's office to try to straighten out whatever was wrong with Posey's account. She got a busy signal. When she tried again, the call went to voicemail. Between one call and the next, the office had closed and was going to stay that way through Veterans Day. Frustrated, she drove home. It was just after 4 in the afternoon, and the house was quiet. Her sister either hadn't risen from bed or had shut herself up in her room. Exhausted, Charlie went straight to her mattress and face planted on it. When she woke, the house smelled like something was burning. She found that she'd been clutching the red book to her chest, as though it were a stuffed bear. In the kitchen, Posey glared at a sheet pan of blackened cookies. "You didn't come home last night," she said. "Neither did Vince. And what are you wearing?" Charlie looked down at the athleisure the spa had picked out for her. With a shrug, she sat on a chair and tried to pry up a cookie. She could use some sugar. "Vince left. Packed up his stuff. He's gone." She'd expected Posey to be thrilled, or at least smug, but she appeared shocked instead. "You dumped him?" Charlie shook her head. "No, I told you, he left." "But why?" "Because his name isn't really Vincent Damiano. He's Edmund Carver, and he's filthy rich, and he's supposed to be dead." Charlie sighed, gave up on the cookies, and went to pour herself some cereal. All they had were bran flakes, boring, and purchased by Vince at her request. She poured them into a bowl. "Seriously?" Posey said. "I think he's in trouble," Charlie said. "I mean, obviously he's in trouble, but he's in more trouble, and it's got to do with his missing shadow." Vince had been 13 when Salt took him in, troubled, and probably desperate for stability. What might he have been willing to do for that? She bet the answer was absolutely anything. Posey poked at the burnt cookies with a slightly melted plastic spatula that was probably leaching toxins into their baked goods. A chunk of one came off. "Who's after him?" "It's a little bit of a complicated story. Do you remember Mom's old hocus-pocus friend, Rand?" Posey wrinkled her nose. "That old guy that was always hanging around with you. Didn't he die in some really weird way?" "He was murdered," Charlie said. Posey shook her head. "No, that's not it. They found him with another body in his car. Suicide or murder-suicide. I remember now. Dad blamed Mom for letting you go off with him all those times. He was worried that guy had done stuff to you like everyone figured he did to that girl before he killed her." Her father had, of course, said absolutely nothing to her. Until this moment, Charlie hadn't known he'd been aware of Rand's existence. It was hard to balance her surprise with annoyance at Posey, who apparently thought that Charlie just misremembered one of the most horrific events of her life. "Rand was murdered," she said. "I know, because I was there." Posey began to open her mouth, possibly to object, and then abruptly closed it. "Vince's grandfather killed him. Lionel Salt." "Why were you there?" Posey asked, her voice much quieter and less sure. "Because Rand was a con artist," Charlie said, "and I was his helper. Like a magician's assistant, but for crime." "So nothing like a magician's assistant," Posey said. Charlie ran her finger through the blackened crumbs. "Look, Rand wasn't the best guy. He was vain and irritable and conned me into working for him in the first place. But he taught me a lot. And he didn't deserve to die, and definitely not like he did. No one deserves to die like that." "You always told Mom you wanted to go with him." Posey bit a cookie, then made a face and put it back. "I thought he was buying you stuff. And back then I was envious, but then later I didn't know what to think. You always had money. And, well, he was a creep." When she put it like that, it did sound bad. Charlie wondered more than ever what their mother had thought she was doing with Rand, and why she'd been okay with it. Charlie chewed her good-for-you cereal, frowning. Her past problems might be unsolvable, but Vince was the key to fixing her current problems. He either had the Liber Noctum, or could tell her its whereabouts. And if he was really attempting to make his evil shadow into an evil person, maybe he'd be done by Saturday and she could take the book back to Salt. And if it felt like a relief to have a reason to contact him, she refused to dwell on that. Pulling out her phone, she sucked in a breath as she tapped his name, waiting for it to ring. A moment later, an automated voice told her that the number had been disconnected. Of course it had. Well, she'd spent the better part of a decade finding things. She could find one tall guy with no working credit cards and a fake ID. Charlie looked across the kitchen to her sister. "Do you think you could be friends with your shadow?" she asked. "Like, come to really care about it?" Posey frowned consideringly for a moment. "There's a lady who married the Berlin Wall. She was super devastated when they knocked him down. Carried around a brick for a while." Posey had a point, but that wasn't what Charlie had meant. "Yeah, okay, but could you reasonably be friends with it?" "I don't know." "Yeah," Charlie said. "Me neither." "If it could talk, maybe," Posey said, still chewing over the question. "But then aren't you just talking to yourself?" Charlie frowned at the floor. She hadn't been talking about her own shadow, but perhaps she should have been. It was as unresponsive as ever. Definitely not friendly. "You hate me a little, don't you?" Posey gave her a look. "You mean because it's unfair that it's your shadow that's quickening when becoming a glowmist is a thing I want most in the world?" Charlie nodded. "I'm angry," Posey said. "At the universe. And at you, I guess, even though I know it's not your fault. I'll get over it. But if you fuck this up, I will hate you." Charlie sighed, half sure she was fucking it up already, and entirely sure she'd fuck it up somewhere down the line. That was just her nature. Charlie Hall, maker of mistakes, patron saint of disaster. The only things she'd ever been good at were trickery and deception, so she better stick to those. Paul Echo had gotten a page of the Liber Noctum somehow. If Vince sold it to him, there'd be some record of the transaction. Maybe Vince had left Echo with a phone number that worked, or even better, an address. Curiosity Books, that was the name of Echo's shop. Well, Charlie was feeling curiouser and curiouser. "I'm going back out," she said, heading to her bedroom for a change of clothes. Posey gave her a sideways look. "You coming home tonight? I'm going to order lo mein." "Get me some," Charlie called back. "I can always eat it for breakfast." Curiosity Books was on the third floor of a slightly shabby converted mill building, just above a concrete artisan and across the hall from a circus school where small children were taught how to juggle and spin plates. The locks on the doors were a joke. Charlie didn't even need to pick it. She just slid her big white points card into the gap between the frame and the door, then brought it up hard enough to depress the latch bolt. Turning the knob, she nudged the door with her hip. It opened. The walls were lined with bookshelves that seemed to have been scavenged from every library closeout sale and Craigslist giveaway in the neighboring towns. The volumes were so tightly packed that Charlie wondered how any of them could possibly be removed. Cardboard boxes had been stacked in small towers, some with their sides ripped, others containing more folded boxes inside, presumably for shipping. High on the back wall, above a bank of windows, an unattributed quote had been painted. "The universe belongs to the curious." An old 1950s-style metal desk rested in the middle of the floor, with a computer humming away on top, an ancient-looking landline phone, and a label printer. Loose paper carpeted the floor, as though recently pawned through. Charlie walked from one end to the other, inhaling the powdery dust of old books. A locked glass cabinet had been smashed, and the shelves inside emptied. A single bookshelf rested on the floor, books seeping out from underneath. She went back to the desk, sat down, and moved around the mouse in a circle. After a moment, the computer monitor sprang to life, showing a ridiculously cluttered screen. She opened a search window and typed in name:"Noctum." Nothing came up. She replaced it with name:"Blight." And that got nothing too. Then she tried inventory and got a .xl file. When she opened it, she found a list of books Paul Echo had in the store, with short summaries, the price Paul paid for them, and the price he'd sold them for. She typed Noctum into the search area of the file. No results. Frustrated, Charlie took out her cell phone and called Balthazar. He answered on the third ring. "Darling," he said, drawing out the vowel. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "What if I want to take the night sing job?" she asked, kicking the file drawer and making the chair spin. "Too late, alas. I hear someone got the folio already. Regretting it? Don't worry, I have a half-dozen other jobs. A few out of state if you're willing to travel. A few impossible if you're looking for a thrill." "Always," Charlie said. "But who wanted them?" "Wanted which?" Night Sing's papers. Idly, Charlie began to open the drawers of the desk. They made a grating metallic sound. Balthazar hesitated before answering. "Is there something you ought to tell me?" "I don't think so." In the files drawer, she found dozens of manila folders, all labeled with the dull needs of business. Bills, rent, takeout menus, insurance, bookseller organizations with acronyms ABA, IOBA, NEIBA. It was a puppeteer, wasn't it? There were several underlings from Carapace who wanted the folio, and yes, a puppeteer. A very wealthy puppeteer. He paused, as though troubled. "Now, do you want to tell me how you knew that?" She fought down the urge to show off, to mention that she was aware Raven was the one they'd been taken from. "It's my job to know stuff," Charlie said innocently. She ought to thank Balthazar, hang up, and leave things at that. But she owed him something in the way of information. "Remember that job you said I should do? Finding the Liber Noctum? Salt basically told me he'd kill me and everyone I love if I don't. Good thing I'm not likely to find myself in that category," said Balthazar. "Oh, I don't know. You're growing on me," she told him, as her fingers went to the far back of the files in the bottom drawer, stopping on a thin folder marked Porn. It was empty. "You're trouble, charlatan," he said, but with fondness. "Goodbye, Balthazar," she told him, and hung up. Turning to the computer, she typed porn into the search bar. A folder came up. Inside were a half-dozen JPEGs, 3 MOV files, and another folder marked geriatric porn. That contained a single Excel file. When she clicked it, a new inventory opened, listing a collection of occult books that might be of interest to gloamists. This spreadsheet included the year created, the specialty of the glomist, whether it was a one-off or mass-printed, whether there were other editions, what shelf it was on, and how Paul had acquired it. Then there was a list of glomist ephemera. To hide knowledge from one another, glomists had taken to writing out their secrets in non-traditional ways, stitched into the lining of a leather coat, written in tiny letters inside of artwork. Objects whose real value was disguised so thoroughly that they might be thrown out or sold for pennies at a flea market. And then there were NFTs, popular among the wealthy, and still far from commonplace among most glomists. Paul had one in his inventory, and seemed to have listed it for $100,000 2 weeks ago. Charlie scanned down the list of sellers, looking for Remy, Edmund, Vincent, Red, even Salt. But the only name she recognized was Liam Cloven. Liam Cloven, M.D., Vince's old school chum. It looked as though he'd sold Paul Echo 3 books within a week of the time that Edmund was supposed to have died. According to the entries, 2 were memoirs from the 18th century, worth $500 apiece, which had been kept in the shattered glass cabinet. Clearly, those were gone. The third was Umbra Magis Through History, self-published through Lulu in 2011. Instead of a shelf, the book was marked as being in a cardboard box on the other end of the room, marked with a 7A. Charlie went to retrieve it. As she did, a knock on the door startled her. "Paul!" A gruff voice came from the hall. Book in hand, Charlie went still. The door was slightly ajar, and she saw the moment that it began to swing inward. She ducked down behind some boxes. Someone in heavy work boots crossed the floor toward the desk. "Come on, man," the person said in exasperation. "Paul, you owe me the goddamn rent. You can't hide from me forever." He exited the room with a slammed door. Charlie liked to think of herself as light-footed when she wanted to be. But in an old building, it was almost impossible to tell which floorboards were likely to creak and groan. She figured it would be the better part of valor to stay where she was for 15 minutes until she was sure Paul Echo's landlord had gone. With nothing else to do, she opened up Umbra Magis Through History and read it by the light of her cell phone. It contained a collection of curated excerpts taken from other books. And although the introduction of misinformation was often a concern with reprints, there was an air of authenticity in the sheer neglect with which the author had put it together. Each page was clearly just scans of the original material, in the original font. Charlie scanned through the excerpts from newspapers, histories, and other documents. Whatever she'd thought of how it had been put together, the actual information in the book was compelling. A warrior in Thebes fell in a field of blood, but his shadow fought on until his killer died. A member of a shadowy secret society operating around the time of the Order of the Golden Dawn claimed she was able to send her consciousness out of her body at night and discover her enemies in their most private moments. That same account suggested that while her shadow was on a mission, she was vulnerable to other shadows taking control of her body. A mystic attempted to feed his shadow all of his blood and live on through it. A woman had woken on a hillside to 3 elderly folks trying to cut off her shadow at her feet. She shouted and they ran. She never found out exactly what they'd been doing, but she had a sense that if they had succeeded, something terrible would have happened. A man had nearly choked to death when a dark figure had turned to smoke and gone down his throat. A servant carrying a candle and entering the room by chance caused it to flee before its dread mission was accomplished. By the time Charlie looked up from the book, the building was quiet. Tucking the book into her bag, she slipped out the door and down the stairs. She'd have to talk to Liam Cloven, but there was someone she wanted to talk to first. If Red had really murdered Night Singh, then what was Raven doing with his papers? And if Salt was the very wealthy puppeteer looking for them, why would he be scrambling to get the notes of someone from Carapace when he was supposed to be obsessed with the return of the Liber Noctum? In the car, Charlie turned to the empty seat beside her where her own shadow fell. "Okay, kid," she told it. "The universe belongs to the curious."